Thank you for joining us. Welcome to episode 33 of the Blowback Roundtable. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Aaron Good joining us. He's an author of American Exception, and he is currently working on many projects, including a podcast. I know that he's doing also called American Exception, Aaron.
That's right.
So I have been keeping up with some of those episodes. I did see the interview with David Talbot, who wrote a great book on JFK called The Devil's Chessboard. And then you also have other audio podcasts that I've been listening to, just interviewing these great historians and great academics that have done tremendous work in exposing the inner workings of the U.S. empire, etc. So that's kind of what we like to do on the show. Our program is called Blowback, exposing American Imperial Decline, exposing Imperial Decline. So your work is really a good. It really jives with what our show is all about. You know what I'm saying? So I was thinking maybe this morning we could talk a little bit about JFK. You mentioned it's the 60th anniversary of his assassination is coming up. And it's an interesting discussion on what exactly was going on with JFK that made him so intolerable to the ruling establishment, to the point where they felt they had to, take this tremendous risk. It seems like a tremendous risk in just an open air assassination. Any chance you can summarize that in 5 minutes?
Yeah, I think that the significance of it is it's more significant today than ever because of the moment that we're at. I mean, it's always been significant because every year, 10 years afterward, the 10th anniversary, the 20th anniversary, it's been a time to reflect on how to make sense of what had happened for people. And the majority of the public did not believe the state's story about a lone nut shooting 3 shots, and then he gets killed by another lone nut for no reason, just a pimp who walks off the street and kills somebody for no reason. It was totally absurd, and the public didn't really believe it. But what can you do when the media and all the serious institutions deride anyone who questions it by and large? So they foisted this terrible narrative on it, and they just kept it alive by virtue of the fact that they control all of our sense-making institutions, because who can pay people to have jobs where they sit around and talk about politics and news and so on, or history? It's like you have to be connected to the establishment in some way to have that kind of a job. And so that's a way that they managed to keep any sort of consensus from forming that would allow people to adjudicate this. Now, the significance of it is that JFK, when he was elected in 1960, he ran as a Cold War liberal in part because there was really no way you had to accept that orthodoxy at the time of the Cold War and the U.S. being the good guys, freedom being good, and standing up to the Soviets. So he actually ran to the right of Richard Nixon on Cuba and on the missile gap, right? But then when he takes office, he really quickly learns that the Cuba things he was told, he was briefed by the CIA about things, bad pigs beforehand. He realizes that things are very bad there and they can't be trusted, and same for the generals. And the story of the Kennedy administration is really a story of him trying to accommodate these forces. It's not like he immediately said, hey, we're going to be a socialist utopia and spread peace around the world and, forget about all your invested capital everywhere else. We can let them have it all. I mean, he wasn't saying that, but he really was trying to reorient the U.S. Over time. And the issue of nuclear war as being part of the Cold War, he thought this was really unacceptable. He ran for president because he wanted to avoid nuclear war. And then during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he almost ends up presiding over nuclear war. And this, I think, shocked him even more and made him go even further. And so he went in the summer of 63, months, just half a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis he gives the peace speech. And then, within a day, he's also given the civil rights speech. So basically, in the span of 2 days in the summer of 1963, he says we're going to end 2 basically fascist regimes, the Cold War. And I mean, he doesn't go as far as to say it explicitly that, hey, we're going to end the Cold War and we're going to be fascist. But he says that were going to work to find a modus vivendi with the Soviet Union. So he's basically talking about thawing relations and ending the Cold, which I would say was his plan was to end the Cold War, and he dies a few months after that. And so what he wanted, he was attempting to overturn, sort of democratically and as an internationalist statesman, he was trying to overturn the Cold War consensus that the U.S. had established, which was really a cover story for an imperial consensus that the U.S. oligarchy, centered around Wall Street, had devised with the sanction of President Roosevelt, to his discredit. The Council on Foreign Relations devised this whole plan to go for global empire after World War II, and that's what they did. And they created the CIA for that purpose. The CIA's the reason they create the CIA is because the U.S. legitimation, the way the U.S. sells itself, is freedom, democracy, the rule of law. But you can't run a global empire that way. So you have to create the dark part of empire, the sort of fascistic part of empire, has to be denied. And so they create a new branch of government, basically, that isn't in the Constitution, some sort of veto power of the regime, which we're not even allowed to even know what it is. So it's almost as though they add a secret codicil to the Constitution to give themselves a kind of veto power that is absolutely not in the Constitution. The Constitution guarantees due process for everyone. That would include the President of the United States, which means you can't just execute him while he's riding down the street. But that's what they did. And the more you look at it, it's so obvious that this had to be state sanctioned on some level, but some level of the state that we're not privy to, because that's really the only way to explain how the cover-up snapped into action immediately, how you have this Oswald character whose actions are inexplicable without reference to the hand of intelligence. You have it's just, I don't want to rehash all the forensic details because it's overkill at this point. Anyone who looks at it objectively will see that this had to have been carried out by the apex of power in this country, because that's the only way to explain why it could never be adjudicated. If it can't be adjudicated, then that must mean there's no power to hold those who did it accountable, and that's what we've seen. So it's the top of the pyramid, and it's not so shocking. That's just how civilizations work, really. The top stays on top by destroying threats to its hegemony, and that's what Kennedy represented. But we are at a similar crossroads now. The consensus for U.S. empire cannot but be fraying, because the actual prospects for U.S. empire are essentially gone. So the empire that killed Kennedy, I mean, when first Henry Wallace was the first person to say, hey, no, we can't have an American century. When they were making these plans during World War II, he said it needs to be a century of the common man. We need to share American technology and capital with the rest of the world so that they can pursue their own ends together as a community of nations, and the common man will be lifted up. And the common man has been oppressed throughout history. I mean, he's not a Marxist, but he has a materialist understanding of history and how people have been exploited and dominated by imperialism and by other forces. And he wanted it to be a century of the common man, where we could all try to improve society the way that the New Deal at its best tried to reform American society. But he got swept aside by these fascist forces. And he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times around the same time about American fascists. And he was just saying it's big business, people that put profit over human lives. This is the American style of fascism, and there are many of them, and they are powerful, and they would like to control this country. So we were at a crossroads then, and the imperialist won. Kennedy takes office, 20 years later, and he, again, tries to revise this. He is overcome, and the imperialists win. And they go into Vietnam, they take over Indonesia and Congo and Brazil. All these places they put in U.S. clients, and the U.S. establishes a new neo-colonial system. They wreck the old dollar system. They put this new one in. They're even more powerful. Once it all gets consolidated, an even more vicious sort of imperial political economy in the 1980s under Reagan, with this new dollar regime that the U.S. controls, and it doesn't have any connection to gold or anything tangible. The U.S. can just create money out of thin air, and nobody has any options to opt out of the system. And that system is what the U.S. has imposed on the world, in the decades since. Let's say 40 years since Reagan, since this thing gets consolidated, and now we're at the moment where, another chance to redirect American foreign policy was the end of the Cold War. We could have had a peace dividend. We could have changed the way we ran the world, but they wanted to stick with global dominance. They wanted a new American century. 9/11 happens. The U.S. pursues more imperialism after that. All the wars after 9/11, they don't quite go as planned, so they need the Arab Spring to like launch a couple more wars to continue that same agenda. That doesn't go well. The whole idea is to contain any Eurasian challenge of China and Russia and other countries in the Middle East coming together in a way that would counteract the U.S. hegemony, that would act as a counterweight to U.S. hegemony. And so that's what they were trying to stop with the 9/11 wars and the Arab Spring wars. And NATO expansion is in the same vein as that. And they have in all these areas now, the Maidan coup is in 2014, and that all they thought they could just put a base right on a NATO base right on Russia's doorstep, and it didn't go well. It's not gone well. They failed there. They failed in Iraq. They've been asked to leave by the parliament, and they have a smaller presence than they planned, and all the oil contracts are going to Russia and China. In Afghanistan, they've withdrawn. In Syria, they are just illegally occupying, brazenly stealing oil from the Syrians, essentially, and occupying illegally a country that they illegally invaded after illegally arming a bunch of jihadis to try to overthrow the Assad government, and even those white helmet propaganda assets there, getting all the liberals and even some leftists cheering for the CIA and for jihadis. It's a really sick spectacle, but it is failing now. I mean, the BRICS and de-dollarization is continuing rapidly. The Russian head of state, the Chinese head of state are saying explicitly that this era of the West ruling the world is coming to an end, and we are de-dollarizing. I mean, they're more on the same page and explicit about these things. There's peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran, so everything in the Middle East seems to be slowly shaping up in the way that is favorable to not the U.S. empire. And so now the new flashpoint is Israel, and this really is going to bring things into relief here. I think parts of the U.S. establishment, the crazies, would like a wider war because they see it as their only chance to maybe knock over the chessboard and maintain U.S. hegemony. But other countries don't. And so when we look at here's this, all this is happening now. We look back 60 years later, but previous to the Kennedy assassination, and what Kennedy was saying is what we should have done. We should have tried to make America the friend to developing countries, so that we could all have a world based on cooperation and so on. Because what the U.S. has tried to do to rule the world, you can't rule the world forever. You're going to generate more enemies, more hatred, and there's going to be a backlash, and the party's going to end. The people that were running the U.S. empire didn't believe that. They believed they were special and magical and exceptional, and that the rules of history didn't apply to them. So they killed Kennedy, and they successfully put out these, use these sort of fascist imperialist tactics like the war in Vietnam, the Indonesia coup, et cetera, a financial sort of domination, with the IMF and all these other predatory economic practices. And it's a terrible regime. 9 million people die annually from malnutrition and other things that could be easily solved with the money that the U.S. has just in its military budget. But we don't, because we want to maintain this system of immiseration and exploitation and expropriation. And the rest of the world is sick of it. It's crumbling, and it's not tenable anymore. And I think if people look back at the Kennedy assassination and understand it, they'll see that there were elements in the U.S. and even in the U.S. establishment that, for different reasons, whether pragmatism or morality or some combination of them, wanted a different path. And Kennedy wanted a different path, and he was killed for it. And that's a profound thing, because it shows the nature of the apex of power in this country. And it shows that we don't live in a real democracy. We live in a democracy so long as the people at the very top are able to rig it with their money and power. Then that's the democracy we have. But if somehow the other side wins, the side of humanity, then they could just assassinate that person and lie about it, and use their control of the media and academia to perpetuate that lie decade after decade. But it happened. The truth is there, and the truth of our current situation is there, and that's what we have to deal with now.
Yeah, amazing. That's a amazing summary of just the past 75 years. And I mean, I could not agree more. I could not have said it better. I really appreciate that. Carlo?
Well, I was just going to say we should mention the Bay of Pigs because that really turned Kennedy around because he realized he was lied to by the Central Intelligence Agency and people like the Dulles brothers. But what I like, I put your book American Exception on the same level as Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. What Howard Zinn did for um, uh, domestic the domestic history of the United States, especially labor, you do for U.S. foreign policy, especially after World War II and with the advent of the OSS becoming the CIA under Truman's aegis. It's and I want to recommend right now the book to everybody out there
I see
who's
you've got a
not
lot of
aware of
flagged
it.
pages.
What's that?
You got a lot of flagged pages.
Yeah, I do.
Are you
And
you want to argue with something about, or those are just ones you reread? Those are pages you reread.
those are things I was especially taken with. Yeah. So but I just wanted to mention the Bay of Pigs at this point.
Yeah, it was a weird. I mean, it was very foolish plan. That, and Kennedy did realize it was never gonna work, and they knew it wasn't gonna work. I mean, that was the he knew that he'd been played and that they thought he would fold, and that pissed him off. Um, he was a bit smarter than I think people recognized. I think they perceived him as a rich kid and a vain person, which he probably was on some level, but he was also very smart and he had some he did seem to have some sense of morality. I don't think he was purely running for self-aggrandizement, although even if he was, if the way you want to aggrandize yourself is by like being the hero of the world peace and stuff. There's worse things you can do.
So the Bay of Pigs can kind of be seen as an effort to draw, to force Kennedy's hand and have him mobilize the United States military into a war with Cuba.
Yeah,
basically, right?
And maybe even more than that. I wonder that they have strategies of trying to manipulate leaders where, as much as it being about Cuba, perhaps it's just in general about getting him into some sort of national security hot water anyway, making him have to take a more hawkish position, maybe ratchet up the Cold War, by starting more of a war and so on. Like they may have had different agendas there that went beyond even Cuba. I'm thinking about like when Obama takes office and like, look at what he was faced with. He was faced with the financial crisis right away. It's uncanny. I mean, it can't be a coincidence that happens the way that it does. I think that right at the end of a lame duck presidency, and it ended up being really what amounted to a huge heist, a huge upward transfer of wealth, if you actually look at what happened. And then Obama, immediately as he takes office, he's got to deal with this enormous problem, and like you're flat-footed there. I mean, I think they may try to do that. They may have tried to do something similar to Obama, and even though I think there was less doubt about where he really was standing than there would have been about.
I was going to say it was fortunate for Obama that his cabinet happened to all be part of Citigroup, so that made it easier for him to deal with the economic crisis.
You knew where it was going to go. In retrospect, I worked for Obama, and then after that happens, it's like, my God. We should have known these things. The bailing out the banks, but not the homeowners, when it would have been way cheaper to bail out the homeowners, that was, despicable. And then the Libyan war also, and then not going after Bush for torture. This is how Obama really betrayed
a war on whistleblowers
forces. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out too that the anti-Castro Cubans who were pissed off about the way Kennedy handled the Bay of Pigs while it was happening. Dulles really expected that Kennedy would send in air power when the anti-Castro Cubans that invaded were losing, which was kind of inevitable. And they were certain he would be forced to send in air power, and he didn't. And that was one of the. If you read anything about the anti-Castro Cubans, Santos Trafficante Jr., people like that, that was what stuck in their craw. this fact that Kennedy didn't step up when they really
Yeah.
needed him, and with those guys and that mindset, that's you're you're gonna die. You're not. You're gonna. If I get a chance to be part of that, I relish that opportunity. So
Yeah, well,
that's
they were part, the anti-Castro Cubans, and Traficante is, of course, of Italian extraction, but he and Lansky, who was also not a Cuban either, but that was part of that milieu of mafia and Cuban exiles, and they were unhappy about the Cuban Revolution because they lost all their rackets or their jobs as enforcers or whatever they did for the old regime. So they were a vicious set of people, but not the kind of people who would be able to place Oswald in Minsk and in Mexico City and so on. So they were kind of they were pissed about Kennedy, but they were lower level. Like they were more kind of useful tools. Although some of them I think may have played them. It seems like some guys like Sergio Arcacha Smith may have had enough dirt on, and maybe Orlando Bosch. People that speculate about him being somehow involved in that whole thing. So there were some Cubans who actually seemed to have participated in that whole thing and then used it as, they had leverage over them after that, which may explain why they were partly able to get away with the drug smuggling and stuff. Because then after that, Operation 40 people in the 60s and 70s, they were involved in all sorts of scandalous things. These Bay of Pigs veterans, I mean, they go on to disposable sort of legmen for the mafia and the CIA together because they do all the
yeah.
stuff.
I mean, Posada Carrila is
You can move
that
on
airliner. Yeah.
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 I learned some very interesting things. One particularly very interesting thing that I did not know. This was I think when you were talking to David Talbot about Kennedy's brother who was killed in California. He was, running for president, obviously. But I didn't realize Garrison had predicted that he was going to be assassinated. So that was quite interesting.
People.
So he told a reporter that or something, right?
He told Larry King that.
Larry King, not just a reporter.
Larry King Larry King was just for whatever reason. Larry King was helping was an intermediary, like maybe delivering money or something from somebody else who wanted to support the Garrison investigation. And then he drops Garrison off at the airport in late May or something. Garrison gets out of the car, and the last thing he says to Larry King is, "They're going to kill Bobby." And then he just gets on his plane. And he had tried to also, I believe it may have been through Mort Saul. He tried to tell the Kennedy people, "Hey, you need to state your intention to go after the killers of your brother because that's the only way you're going to protect yourself." And Kennedy never did it. That has to haunt at least Bobby Jr. I think the rest of the family is in denial about it by and large. I mean, maybe Kathleen Townsend Kennedy has spoken about it, but the rest of them, they can't even really deal with it. It was David himself who told Bobby Jr. about this in 2004, and he wasn't ready to come around to it. And David had interviewed everybody in the Kennedy entourage that was still alive, pretty much, and he said, like, no, your dad was going to reinvestigate, the assassination. And Bobby just kind of stared down at his plate over breakfast while David was telling him this, 20 years ago, because he didn't. In the family, they just said they don't talk about it because it's so painful, which I guess I can understand. I don't know because there's nothing like that in my family.
Right.
Because really, how Bobby is now is how Bobby Jr. talks about it now is how you would think people would talk about it. But if it was my family, but then, it's weird. Rich family. You don't want to be stuck on this. You're going to lose all of your establishment credibility. They were worried about that. So.
You think RFK Jr. is going to be? Is he a viable candidate? Does he have your support or?
I am still writing for the Kennedy Beacon, which is the super PAC for Bobby Kennedy. But we are not. I don't tell any lies about him. We and other people have been trying to move him, especially on Israel. If you look at his poll numbers, he is polling better than any third-party candidate ever, and He's polling as well as Ross Perot was, at least, if not better, which is surprising. And considering that he has been subjected to more media um, slander and hatchet jobs than anyone else. So I disagree with him on a number of positions, but I don't think that I would be nuts to think that somebody with my leftist critique of imperialism and of capitalism would be president of the United States. Well,
Right.
unfortunately, the president, who is the president of the United States, has a lot of power, potentially existential for humanity, especially as the empire is now crumbling and it really isn't viable. And he's the only person who is a viable candidate who is speaking about these in a remotely sensible way. He's saying, we are an empire. He said to me point blank, the U.S. empire has collapsed, which is quite a statement because, the other candidates don't even admit that we have an empire, much less that it's collapsed. And he's talked about the need to avoid nuclear war, like his father or his uncle and his father worked to make sure that happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis and so on. So I am holding out hope that he is going to revise his Israel position because there are limits to how much tolerance I can have. He's not in power. He is not a statesman who is in charge of this situation. I think that he painted himself in a corner in different ways. I think he got some bad advice from people in the campaign about how to deal with accusations of anti-Semitism and such. He made some unwise comments about Anne Frank that weren't, categorically wrong. I mean, but he just shouldn't have invoked Anne Frank because in this climate, the Holocaust is like a proprietary propaganda, copyrighted thing almost for like the Israel lobby or something. So people just snap into action if you start talking about anything related to the Holocaust, because it's like this you can only invoke it if you're talking about Israel or something. I don't even really know, but like he caught a lot of flack for that when really all he was saying is like, it like what the totalitarian aspects of what they want to do with like digital currencies and being able to shut off people's banking ability and to surveil them on the internet and make them get chipped and or not, he doesn't say chipped, but like forcing people to have like their vaccination status be something that they have to like present papers on all the time. This is like a tyrannical, horrifying thing that is more totalitarian and far reaching than what the Nazis had. So you can't hide from them anywhere, like like Anne Frank. Now it's kind of a dumb comment in a way because Anne Frank did eventually die, and like of all the things to mention, why bring that up? But once that happened, he starts like trying to like find people that'll say like, oh no, he's not anti-Semitic. They also wrote articles about how he was associating with Nazis, which wasn't fair. These different things seemed to make him associate more with Zionism than I believe he ever really had. I don't think it was a central issue to him. And then he may have some backers who are like that. So that's been a real issue going forward, especially as the fact that he's polling so high, even when this Israel war broke out around the time as he was announcing his independent run. It was the worst possible time for him and the worst possible issue, and he's still polling that high. That to me says that he is a viable candidate. That doesn't mean he's going to win, but the other reason that I think he is viable is that I believe that some parts of the establishment, if what I'm saying about the American empire and American hegemony, which I've been writing about for, I wrote an article in 2015 that was very similar, which I'd really started working on before that, to what I say in the book about U.S. hegemony and how it is crumbling. And now you have the heads of state of Russia and China, essentially saying the same things. Putin and Lavrov and Xi are saying these things, or the Chinese ministers of the government are putting these things out. We're all, it's because it's true. Everybody, we're saying this because it is true. And the calculus for the U.S. has really changed. And for what the U.S. establishment, they actually need, it's in their interest to do what Bobby Kennedy is trying to do, because this country is too corrupt domestically. It cannot rely on international dominance to give it a free pass to pursue whatever crazy things it wants anymore. They need to, it's got to be sobering and horrifying for these people, because everything they've done has been about maintaining hegemony forever and doing things that were damaging to American reputations, and not to mention killing lots of people. And it's all for naught. they're not going to be able to maintain that. And the sooner they realize that, the better, because the risk is that they're going to try something crazy to hold on to this power, and it would lead to nuclear war. And I'm hoping that for people who are not insane, it's going to become more clear that that's the case, and then more establishment figures will rally behind Bobby. Ideally, Bobby will have a much better Israel position. I would hope that when this is said and done, he'll have a better position than Biden and Trump, despite he'll probably, he probably make some Zionist propaganda, couch it in those terms about Israel's right to exist and yada yada. But I'm hoping that he is just saying, because it's also true, it's not in Israel's best interest to do this. The U.S. empire is fading. What are they going to do when that happens? And they are stuck there in that neighborhood with people who really hate them because the Israelis have killed so many of people that they think of as their, Muslim brothers and sisters. They will be despised, and the U.S. will not be the big thug buddy to protect them anymore because the U.S. isn't going to be on top forever. So it's not in Israel's best interest to do what they're doing. Everyone should come to their senses. The time is really right for peace to break out. As crazy as it seems, it's in everybody's best interest. And Kennedy is the only person who's been saying that, and him calling to disclose secrets about the JFK assassination and other matters like that. That would be the best thing, also because it would sort of wipe the slate clean of some of these worst elements. It would discredit the things that need to be discredited if we're going to move forward. In that way, I think he's the person that the sensible establishment will back, which is why I think people like Jeffrey Sachs have endorsed him. I know Sachs has at different points done dubious things, but overall, for the last 20 years, he's been one of the more sensible commentators when it comes to U.S. Hegemony. He's similarly sensible to somebody like Mearsheimer, who it's not like I agree with him politically on everything, but he gets the bigger picture about the tragic implications of U.S. imperialism and the fact that it's not sustainable to go on doing the foolish things that they do to try to rule the world. And so I am hopeful still that that's the case. And I take a lot of shit for that online because I don't know what exactly the people that would bother worrying about whether I'm supporting RFK or not, what they think could be accomplished by me not supporting him or him going down in defeat. Then how does that actually improve anything tangible? But I don't think the left. I think the left. The left in America is sadly, and I'm among them, we are politically losers. We have no influence whatsoever. The only thing I think that they have is their halo and their purity. And so that is what they're defending. The idea that there could even be anything positive that you would actually win is, I think, this is anathema to their way of thinking about this. And so Kennedy, who does have a number of problematic positions on things, I think that they don't understand the Kennedys. They don't understand the dark side of the U.S. state. Most of the people who are more versed in this have a slightly different attitude about it. Although everyone is pissed about his Israel positions, which are totally incompatible with everything else he says. But I will also say what makes it complicated is he's attacked every other center of power in the U.S. pretty much, except for maybe cryptocurrency. I mean, besides that, all the special interests that are responsible for screwing everything up, he's really pissed them off. He's down the line, the military-industrial complex, BlackRock, big pharma, agribusiness. He's sued Monsanto and was a part of that and won a huge settlement against them. DuPont. I mean, he is a person who has alienated the entire power structure of the U.S., except notably and glaringly not the Israel lobby, which was problematic to begin with. But then now that this business with Gaza has broken out, it seems to be untenable. And I'm hoping and I believe that he will soon modify his position. And that's what we're all waiting for. And if he doesn't, then whatever. I don't really care if people, I'm not out here so obsessed with my brand. You know what I mean? Yes, I have a podcast, but I have a podcast because I couldn't teach in academia because I'm too radical a critic of the U.S. empire. I couldn't even teach at a Quaker high school, essentially, because of that. Okay, because they're private schools, and who is it that can afford $50,000 for tuition, right? I mean, you can't really go at the apex of the capitalist power structure when you depend on them to pay the bills. I kind of understand. But that's why I have a podcast. So I'm not a podcaster who was like thinking like, oh, I'm so excited about getting people to like me. And my main concern is like putting my finger in the air and finding out, oh, they don't like this. Oh, let me give the people what they want. Like I don't work for Pepsi, okay? Like I wrote a dissertation in political science knowing that I was going to alienate my entire discipline by doing it. Okay, that is generally how I approach things. I don't mind being, taking an unpopular position. Whether I end up being right or wrong about Kennedy is that remains to be seen. Anytime you back political candidates, you are putting faith in what you think they might do if they win, which oftentimes in America you will be disappointed. Well, if you're lucky enough to win, then you'll be disappointed by what they do because there's so many corrupting forces. But I still am holding out hope that he is going to be able to rise to this occasion, because I do think the reason that he wants to run, because I'm so familiar with his family background and what his father went through, and I think that he wants to run to complete what his father tried to do and his uncle tried to do. And after JFK was killed, Jackie and Robert Kennedy, RFK, they sent a messenger to Moscow to tell the Soviets, we know you didn't kill Jack. It was a domestic right-wing conspiracy. Problem is that what Jack was trying to do, the policy of like peace, and cooperation, is going to have to wait until Bobby gets to the White House, because the new guy is too close to big business, and so he's not going to be helpful. But once Bobby gets to the White House, the work for peace will resume. Okay, that's what they said. So they knew right away what had happened, and they had a plan, the Kennedys did, to get back to the White House. And Bobby Kennedy was assassinated before that could happen. And that's what so Bobby Jr. lost his father at age 14. And it wasn't until 2004, which is almost for almost like 35 years later, that he is first told about his father and uncle in those assassinations by David Talbot, and he doesn't believe him for another like 4 years, because it's like he just can't process it.
Wow.
So this is a profound thing, and I think that is what motivates him. He wants to uncover reveal what happened to JFK, which is what his father wanted to do, and which is part of why they killed him. And he wants to revive the quest for peace and end this idea that the U.S. is going to rule the world like a global dictator. And he wants to end the corrupt merger of state and corporate power. He says this explicitly. Like, this isn't unless it doesn't seem he's getting really at the heart of the matter in some ways, even as he has to moderate these things and spin them in a kind of pro-capitalist way that I don't really like. All right, I totally disagree with. I would, if it were up to me, I'd be like, nationalize Amazon, nationalize Exxon, guillotines. I'm not the person who's going to be winning the White House, and I accept that. But like, what he is saying is important if we care about things like human existence.
I have a question though. Robert Kennedy Jr.'s positions, they have a certain appeal to people who were oriented more to vote for Trump, and I was anti-COVID, COVID, his stance on COVID, and that sort of thing, and also his anti-big big business in any sense, which has bled into the MAGA people. I mean, there is a certain number of them that now see that as an evil, and are behind Trump because they see him as a certain person who can affect change in that arena. But do you think Robert Kennedy Jr. can snatch any of that vote?
I think he has he's gotten some support from the medical freedom people, which were partly supportive of Trump, but then Trump did the vaccine and so on, and has tried to boast about it at some points, and they don't really like that. I can't make total sense of everything that happened with COVID like everyone else. However, it does seem that the critics of lockdowns and vaccines and mandates have been more or less vindicated. I mean, they lied about the fact that the vaccine stopped transmission. That is a huge scandal. that should be so discrediting to people that they should probably be agnostic about the whole thing. Like, it should actually be so sobering that they're like, I don't quite know what to make of this. And the vaccines, I mean, there's a decline in life expectancy that must be related to either the vaccine or the effects of the economic and social psychological effects of the lockdowns. Something that we did there, besides people dying of COVID, has been killing a lot of people, and it's lowered life expectancy quite a bit beyond, because most of the people that died of COVID were so old that it really didn't impact life expectancy that much. So
this country was seeing a decline before COVID, and it's continued for sure. I'm exactly where you're at, Aaron. I'm agnostic about. I'm not sure what to make of it, but I agree. There's definitely good questions, and that is a bit of a rabbit hole we can go down or not. But what I wanted to
said about as much as I said, I don't know about that much, but I tend to think, you know what? I am against the mandates, and I absolutely think that they should not have done an mRNA vaccine the way that they did. It should have been a regular one, and it should have not been mandatory. They had some agendas going on there that were beyond just like trying to treat a disease. And I think if you don't recognize that, then it's a myopia, on the part of the people who just can't get that, who just think they were doing the best. It was weird because the left is like, suddenly the left does not understand corporate capture. Suddenly the left does not understand what big pharma is all about. I mean, the best they could say was like, well, they don't want us to die because then they couldn't exploit us. But like, that's a strange thing to hang your hat on in terms of having faith in this state.
I agree. I think, before we fall down that cliff,
I'm sorry to derail it there, but it's okay. It is a thing that's going to impact how people vote.
I wanted to touch on some of the things you were saying about RFK Jr. So we had Scott Ritter on, and he made a good salient point. That's it's pretty obvious, but politicians have to pander to the preconceived indoctrinations and ideas of the electorate. And so it's just got to be a really difficult thing to navigate if you're actually running to be the president. And if you think you can get there by telling the truth, the straight truth to people, you're going to lose really, really bad. Number one, nobody's going to fund your campaign. And then number two, you're going to piss off a lot of people who don't want their indoctrinations. It hurts them. It hurts their feelings to find out that, what they think is true is not true. So it's tough. And so, look, I like your how you presented RFK Jr.'s campaign. And, I kind of did dismiss him after his stance on Israel. But realistically speaking, if you're going to be viable, you can't just tell the truth all the time about everything. It's just the sad reality. And you made the point when you talked to who was that commentator? You had kind of a contentious interview with this guy, and he's on shoot, the names are escaping. He's on with Glenn Greenwald a lot. Those two have a funny rapport. I love to watch the two of them because they're really catty with each other. But it was a little bit contentious, and we talked about how JFK actually ran a little bit dishonestly too. JFK ran dishonestly.
That's a Mike Tracy debate thing.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah, that was a sort of debate, but we should have had ground rules for that because he just went on too much about it. You did talk about that. It's an important issue. The truth part. When do you tell the
Michael
truth?
Tracy did not look good in that. You did great. So I mean that's my opinion. But we brought up the fact that just to run to public office like JFK did, you've got to be smart. And then once you're in power, everybody does it. I mean, Obama did the same thing. He said all these good things, and then he didn't do anything. JFK said bad things, then he did good things. So RFK is saying some bad things. So anyway, it's just crazy.
No, look, I think about this a lot, and it's a key issue. And it's how do you talk about this in a democracy where it's all about discourse and finding out who has the best views, and then you go for that person. How do you deal with orthodoxies that are so evil but so powerful that you have to adhere to them? In JFK's case, he adhered to the Cold War orthodoxy which meant that he took a more belligerent pose than Nixon in the debates and such. But then he gets killed 3 years later for opposing the Cold War orthodoxy. That should be instructive to people on the left, but because people on the left, for different reasons, they can't solve the assassinations of the 60s ideologically. They can't. Part of it is ideological, and part of it is conformity to people who are in institutions that they revere. So Chomsky and MIT and other people at different foundation-funded think tanks, they all tell you the correct thing to think, and they don't want to go against that. Additionally, if you're saying that Kennedy was killed by the national security state, then you're saying that the national security state would have a reason to assassinate a bourgeois president. That, and they can't say that because ideologically that's wrong. That's you're saying that that there's some agency, and it's all structure. It's all the structure of the economy, and it's all the dialectic just operating like this, like yin and yang in some cosmic sense, right? But we need to understand that. Also, think about the fact that Bobby Kennedy, RFK, 1968, he's running for president. Every time he's asked about his brother, said, "Will you reopen the Warren investigation? Who killed your brother? Don't you want to know?" And he was always like, "The Warren Commission was the fine men who tried to do their best," or whatever. He would say some bullshit about it, and he knew it was bullshit. And it wasn't an issue that he didn't care about, so he just thought he would like. He cared about it more than anything. It wrecked him. By all accounts, he was a shell of himself for quite a long time after his brother died. He felt responsible for it, and he was obsessed with trying to find out what happened and to eventually get justice for his brother. And yet, when he was asked about that, he wouldn't tell the truth to the public. He felt like he couldn't. He felt he had to respect that orthodoxy about the things you can and can't say about the actual American government. But he could send somebody to tell the Soviets. He could say to the Soviets what he couldn't say to the American public. That should be instructive and sobering to people, and it should give them a little bit of perspective when they watch Bobby Kennedy running now and trying to navigate this system. Because if anything, we've got a much more psychotic set of evil, murderous orthodoxies in place now than in 1963. Kennedy, like the level of U.S. politics has declined so drastically since then. And yet RFK really is telling the truth about a lot of very, very important things. He's just not telling the truth about Israel. And that's unfortunate now as we're watching Israel carry out a genocidal campaign, massacring women, children, old people, anyone, indiscriminately bombing people. It's horrifying and disgusting. And even more scary about that is that it actually represents just a tiny portion of the violence and death and destruction that the U.S. presides over year in and year out. It's almost negligible in the aggregate, and that is horrifying because these are horrifying things that we are seeing coming out of there. They're crimes against humanity.
Worse than the Dulles era. I mean, to go back to Billy Bob's point about the election, Kennedy's in 1960, Joe Kennedy used Mayor Daley, Chicago's mayor, as an instrument for fixing the election. That's popular. Lenny Bruce made a joke about it. They're so corrupt, it's thrilling. So that election was insane, not rigged. I mean, but there was a lot of shenanigans that went on, and Joe Kennedy was behind a lot of it. So, you know, I mean, I guess I should just point that out.
It's hard to say. Some of those things, it's hard to know what's apocryphal and what is something that becomes sort of hearsay about all these things. My understanding of what happened in Ohio is that the Republicans also, there was probably Democratic chicanery in Chicago, but there was enough downstate chicanery in Republican-controlled areas that the Republicans did not contest the results in Illinois because of that. That was my understanding of it. They go as far as to say that Joe Kennedy used the mob to bribe everyone in West Virginia. I don't know how well documented those things are. My understanding from some people is that the sourcing on all that is all dubious when it comes down to it, but I don't know. What I will say is, that aside, the Kennedys did play to win, and politics is dirty, and so they weren't an exception to that. They didn't win by not playing. By not doing the things you have to do. Yeah. It's a dirty, dirty thing.
So, but that does bring us to Trump, because Carlo has brought him up a couple times. He lives rent-free in Carlo's mind. Actually, that's not true. That's not true.
He's not the only one in America that's
no, yeah. Do you think, what are your thoughts about Trump? So a lot of people see that, the working class majority are gonna cling to Trump and use him as a stick to beat the establishment with. So do you but there's other people. Trump's very divisive among the left, as you may have or may not have heard. Is he going to be a better option than the status quo, with maybe the next president being, DeSantis or the governor of California?
I cannot make a lesser evil argument between Biden or Trump, so I'm not even going to try to do that.
Okay.
I think that there's some people, some smart people and decent people, made lesser evil arguments about Biden before, but I think with the Ukraine war and the fact that with every day, the way that war goes on, it risks nuclear Armageddon through miscalculation or an error or anything else. It's criminal and it's irresponsible. And on top of that, he's, by telling them the Russians invaded with 40,000 people. It was basically just to bring Ukraine to the negotiating table, which they did, and they were about to hammer out a deal that would have ended this before it even really started. It would have wrapped it up in April. The U.S. said, "Don't do it." The result is 500,000 dead Ukrainians. The average age in the Ukrainian military is mid-40s now. They're losing badly, and they're going to. I think they're headed for a catastrophic breakdown of their military. So. And all the while, it has risked nuclear doomsday for nothing. So Trump is no lesser evil. Biden is no lesser evil, but Trump, I can't say he is either. I mean, I don't understand. He has no coherent worldview that you can understand. The one thing you could say about him is that he didn't want to he was the only president who didn't start any new major wars in quite a long time. And I don't think it's obviously not because he's read Michael Parenti and he understands that the U.S. empire needs to be defeated. It's because Trump cares about Trump, and he knew it wasn't in his political interest to start these wars, which are very unpopular. For that reason, I think that reason alone, the fact that he's more selfish rather than dedicated to the U.S. empire first and foremost, I think the deep state or the empire, whatever you want to call it, they don't like Trump. But that doesn't mean that he's a good guy. He's an unpredictable figure, and he's got even worse views on Israel than anyone else. I mean, he's worse than Bobby, and and he doesn't have any other good things that outweigh that. So I don't see how you vote for either of those people as a lesser evil at this point. If you're being honest,
any parallels between the assassination of Kennedy and the Trump gate? What was it? Russiagate?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, in a way, that was such a hoax. I mean, that's just there's so many of these things like the Russiagate, the Maidan coup, blowing up the Nord Stream, where it's oh yeah, I forgot about that massive crime that was in broad daylight that has never been adjudicated, because that's what really the U.S. is at this point. Our history is more or less a series of unadjudicated crimes. I mean, in recent decades. So yeah, he was set up that way. I mean, he was set up sort of like Kennedy was sort of sandbagged with the Bay of Pigs. JFK was. Trump had this Russiagate bullshit right off the bat that was wrong-footing him and making him pursue policies and strike poses he didn't want to strike. And I think that he took more. They armed Ukraine during this time, which Obama didn't do, in part because Trump had to show that he was not soft on Russia, or he wasn't a Russian. He wasn't Russian. They didn't have blackmail on him or whatever. I mean, it was ridiculous. But you could argue that because of Russiagate, which was a hoax and a crime against democracy, really, that led to the Maidan War, because it made people so anti-Russian, and it led to the arming of Russia, which shouldn't have, or the arming of Ukraine, that it set the stage for this. And so it was catastrophic. But it doesn't mean Trump's a good guy. It just is that's just the way that this regime operates. It's really ghastly when people. I'm really hoping that they don't blow up the world and that we have some sensible reforms here, so that we can really look at what happened during this time period.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I see much light at the end of the tunnel, or whatever cliche you want to throw at it.
He's a pessimist.
Especially after this meeting with Biden and Xi, I mean, obviously Biden has lost his faculties, and as an old man, I know how that feels a little bit. Um, and and immediately after the meeting with Xi, the first thing that comes out of his mouth is he calls Xi a dictator again, as though in his head that was the the sum of what he can deliver for that, and that turned. You could see Blinken
Yeah, that was good.
viscerally
I know that was so.
cringe.
Blinken is also an idiot, but even he knows that, like, I mean, he seems that way to me anyway. But even he is like, "Oh, this is not good." But the fact, also consider that. Consider the fact that the U.S. is in now. They have to not say the wrong thing to other people. They worry about that. That is something to
No,
do.
that's the point I was going to make. Like Blinken didn't seem happy with that because I thought maybe the last time it happened, it was on purpose because they don't really want to get anywhere with these discussions. They don't want to improve relations, but you kind of have a different, opinion of that when you see Blinken's visceral reaction to, and that just seems like a stupid Biden moment as opposed to a calculated attempt to, make sure that the relationship doesn't improve any.
I mean, it was weird, but I do need to run
Yeah.
now, but I will. Let me respond to what Carlos says about being pessimistic about it, which there's every reason to be pessimistic about the state of the U.S. because the trajectory is very bad because the U.S. just does bad things, which creates a bad situation politically and gives bad people more power, and so on and so forth. And the empire has functioned this way, but it is now collapsing, and so the forces that are on the other side, we are a part of it. If we are internationalists, they're going to overcome the U.S. empire, and that we actually have a lot of people and a lot of power on our side. It's just not in the U.S. political system. The global South, China, Russia, the world. You can see these votes on Israel and Palestine. You can see that the U.S. is very isolated, and the empire is really on its last legs. Although I don't know how, I can't put a time frame on it, but I think that there's reason to think that like this is going to end, and then we're going to be able to move on to a different part of history where there's a hope for some progress, because we know that the U.S. empire, as the global leader, top dog, is incapable of reforming itself in an enlightened way. But they're not going to have to, because they're either going to and be part of an international community, or they're going to be surpassed and eclipsed by an international coalition that is for international law and sovereignty of countries, independence, and internationalism. I mean, this seems to be the way forward. Multipolarity is coming whether we like it or not, unless the U.S. blows up the world.
Yeah, but
And so that's reason for optimism.
what's that disintegration of the U.S. going to look like?
That's the question.
Yeah.
Is it going to be a literal disintegration, like with the atom bomb, or is it going to be a managed thing, or is it going to be economic and social catastrophe?
Or are we going to start working with China?
Well, that's that. I mean, if we do that, we're all dead. If we go to war with China, we're all dead. And
working with, not go to war with. Working
to actually run. I don't think China is trying to do what the U.S. is trying to do, because I don't think they can, and they also see how stupid it would be. They think in the long term, and to them, the blip of the U.S. compared to like Chinese dynasties, they're smarter than us in terms of having historical sense about things. We're so enthralled to our own propaganda and myths that the elites in the U.S. have stupefied themselves. The idolatrous worship of their own ideology has made them idiots. And now we're seeing the outcome of letting idiots run everything. But that is gonna change. It's just, what's it gonna mean? But the last other thing that I will say that is hopeful about this is, without the empire, without the ability to print all the money in the world, which we're gonna lose, without the ability to go in and kill anyone anywhere that you want to, without that ability, what does the U.S. establishment really have left? The only thing they have left is the facade of liberal democracy, and they're going to have to try to make democracy somewhat real just to salvage their own legitimacy, domestically or internationally, if there's any of it left by the time they actually do decide to bow to reality. And that is are they going to do this? Are they going to understand their situation? Or are they really going to wreck shit and burn it down? But that's not in their interests. but they've been stupid so far about advancing their own interests. But are they going to eventually wake up? I think that they will, because their own material interests are so great that at some point they will realize that they're actually not serving them. And so, just for selfish reasons, the U.S. establishment, which is selfishness is their defining trait, just for those reasons, they should be compelled to reform this in a timely fashion. And maybe the 2024 election will be where we see that. And if not, then whatever. We go on and we deal with the situation at hand, and we respond to things as best we can. We adapt.
Aaron, thank you so much. I could not have said that better, and you said everything that I think. So I really appreciate you coming on. I hope to have you back. Yeah, that's the last word. Thank you, everybody. We will be back next week, Tuesday.
Thanks, Carlo.
Thanks again, Aaron.
Thank you, Aaron.